The shot came from 2,300 meters out, through a crosswind that shifted twice in the final second, and it hit exactly where she'd called it. That was 3 years before anyone at Fort Bragg knew her name. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Sergeant First Class Ryland stood at the edge of the parking lot outside the NCO club on a Tuesday evening in October, finishing the last of a cup of bad coffee and watching a group of men she outranked in ways they didn't yet understand. She wasn't in uniform. She was wearing a flannel shirt with a frayed cuff and jeans that had seen better years, and her hair was down, which she almost never wore it. And the 3 men by the entrance had already looked at her twice, the second time with the particular expression that men get when they decide they've already figured out what kind of woman someone is. She went inside anyway. This is the part of the story that people sometimes ask about later. Why she went in. The answer is simple and unsatisfying. She was meeting someone, a friend. Staff Sergeant Odom had texted her at 17:45 saying he was buying the first round and she owed him from the last time, which she did not dispute. That was the entire reason she was there. There was no premonition, no plan, just bad coffee and a favor she owed. The NCO club at Bragg on a Tuesday had a specific quality to it. Not loud, not quiet, somewhere in the middle, with the television above the bar running a game nobody was really watching, and the kind of low-level conversation that happens when people are tired but not ready to go home yet. Ryland got a beer she didn't particularly want and found a table near the window. Odom wasn't there yet, which surprised nobody. He was constitutionally incapable of being on time to anything that didn't involve a formation. She sat alone, and she was comfortable sitting alone, which was something she'd learned to be over many years of being the only woman in many rooms. Comfortable didn't mean invisible. It meant she noticed everything and required nothing in return. The 3 men from the parking lot came in about 10 minutes after she did. Their names, for the record, were Breckenridge, Tully, and a captain named Fairchild, who was the kind of officer that enlisted people learn to read quickly, the kind who has the authority, but not quite the judgment to match it. Breckenridge was loud in the way that men get loud when they're performing for each other. Tully laughed at everything Breckenridge said, slightly too quickly. Fairchild carried himself off with the specific posture of a man who knows his rank. Is the most interesting thing about him. They didn't sit near her. They didn't need to. The room was small enough. Ryland finished about a third of her beer and checked her phone. Odom had sent a message. Running late, 20 mins, sorry, buy yourself something good. She put the phone down and looked out the window at the parking lot, at the way the floodlight was catching the dust, still settling from a truck that had just pulled out. She was thinking about something else entirely. She was thinking about a conversation she'd had that morning with a doctor at Womack about her left shoulder, which had been giving her trouble since a fast rope insertion in 2021 that went wrong in a way that nobody had put in the report. Because the mission itself had gone right, and those two things sometimes cancel each other out in the documentation. She was not thinking about Breckenridge. But Breckenridge was by that point thinking about her. This is the thing about a certain type of man in a certain type of mood. The presence of a woman sitting alone in a room full of men registers as either an invitation or a provocation, and the difference between those two interpretations depends entirely on what she does when they approach. If she's warm, it's an invitation confirmed. If she's cold, it becomes a provocation that requires a response. There is no option in which she is simply a person sitting in a room. Breckenridge came over without being asked. He said something she didn't respond to. She was aware of what he said. She simply didn't find it worth answering, which she understood would register as rudeness, but which she calculated was still preferable to the alternative. Her shoulder hurt. She was tired. Odom was 20 minutes away. She wanted to finish her beer and not talk to anyone. He said it again, louder. She looked at him then, not in a way that invited conversation. In the way that people look at something they are assessing, which was, if he had known anything about her, an extremely dangerous signal to be receiving. He didn't know anything about her. What Breckenridge knew in that moment was that she hadn't laughed at his joke. What he didn't know was that she had spent 7 months embedded with a special operations task force in a country he would not be cleared to name in casual conversation. He didn't know she had qualified expert with every weapons system her unit was authorized to carry, and several they were not. He didn't know about the 2,300-meter shot. He didn't know about Kandahar, or about the mountain in Paktika province, or about the night that her spotter had been hit. and she had managed the exfil on her own because the extraction window was closing and someone had to make the call. He just knew she hadn't laughed. So he said the thing that men say when they run out of other material. He leaned down and he said it close, like proximity was a kind of argument, and what he said was something about how she was too pretty to be sitting alone and looking so serious. She said without particular emotion, "I'm waiting for someone." He said she could wait for two people at once. Tully laughed. Fairchild, to his credit, looked slightly uncomfortable. That discomfort would matter later, when the situation had fully developed and he had to decide what kind of officer he wanted to be remembered as. What happened next happened fast. Breckenridge reached out and touched her arm. Not hard, but deliberately, in the way that's meant to say, "I'm choosing not to respect the distance between us," and she stood up. Standing brought her to about his chin height, which in the economy of these situations counted against her. It shouldn't have, but it did. He smiled. Then he did something that, when people heard about it later, when the details got around, as they always do on a post, made even the people who hadn't been there go quiet for a moment. He put his hand on her face, not a punch, a slap. The way you'd correct a child. The way you'd humiliate someone you'd already decided didn't require your full effort. The room went still. This is the part that civilians sometimes miss when they imagine military service. The chain of command runs on a very specific logic, and one of the things it produces, in people who've operated inside it for long enough, is an extremely refined capacity to assess a situation in fractions of a second and choose from a set of responses that civilians don't have available. Not because those people are dangerous in some reckless sense, but because they've trained the emotional sequencing out of it. You don't feel first and act second. You assess, you select, you execute, and you process the rest later. Ryland processed. What happened in the next 4 seconds was not something Breckenridge had any framework to anticipate. She moved in a way that had nothing theatrical about it. No warning, no telegraphing, nothing that looked like the beginning of anything until it was already the middle of something else. His wrist was controlled before he understood she had his wrist. She used the leverage that his own height gave her, which was, in retrospect, the detail people who knew what they were watching noted with a certain appreciation. She put him on the floor without raising her voice. Tully stepped back. Fairchild didn't move at all, which again would become relevant. Breckenridge was on the floor and she was standing over him, and she was not breathing hard. She said very quietly, "Don't." That was all. She sat back down. She picked up her beer. The room remained quiet for a beat, longer than was comfortable, and then the ambient noise of the bar resumed in pieces, like a machine restarting after a power interruption. Breckenridge got up. He said something she didn't acknowledge. He and Tully left. Fairchild stood there for another moment. That moment of calculation that defines a lot of people. And then he sat down at a table by himself and ordered something and didn't look at her for the rest of the evening. Odom arrived at 20:27, 14 minutes later than he'd estimated, which was actually early for him. He sat down, looked at her face, looked at the mostly finished beer, looked at the table near the door where Fairchild was sitting alone, and said, "What did I miss?" It wasn't a question, really. She said, "Nothing worth discussing." He ordered 2 more beers and didn't push it, because he'd known her long enough to understand what nothing worth discussing generally meant, which was, "Something happened, it's over, I handled it, and I'd prefer to talk about something else." He respected that. It was one of the reasons they were friends. What Odom did not know, sitting across from her that Tuesday night, was that Captain Fairchild was already on his phone. The report landed on the desk of Colonel Harmon at 0630 the following morning. Harmon was not a person given to dramatic reactions. She'd spent 29 years in the Army in ways that tended to burn the drama out of a person's operating system. She read the report which Fairchild had written with what she recognized as the particular careful phrasing of a man who knew he'd done something by inaction and was now constructing a paper record that suggested otherwise. She read it twice. Then she pulled Sergeant First Class Ryland's file, which she had accessed before, in a different context, on a different matter, and which she had at that time flagged in the private shorthand she used for people she thought deserved more careful attention. The file was, in the Army's preferred bureaucratic understatement, substantial. Ryland had enlisted at 19, following a path that nobody in her family had taken before. She'd grown up in rural western Pennsylvania, in the kind of town where the only thing that reliably produced were good athletes, and people who were good at leaving. She was both. She had been a competitive shooter at 16, which in her county was not unusual, but what was unusual was the precision and the stillness she brought to it, the ability to calculate variables that most shooters learn only after years of field experience, and that she seemed to access as naturally as breathing. She qualified as a sharpshooter in basic, then expert. Then she cross-trained in a program that didn't advertise itself and didn't appear in the public-facing organizational charts of the units involved. She deployed for the first time at 22. She deployed for the fifth time at 29. Between those deployments, there were things in the file that carried the specific formatting of classified documentation. Summary descriptions without operational details, dates without locations, assessments without context. The kind of record that, if you knew how to read it, told you more by its omissions than its contents. Harmon knew how to read it. What the file said, in the language that files like this used, was that Sergeant First Class Rylan had done things into places that most people would never be cleared to discuss, and had done them well enough that the people who managed those kinds of things had put her name on lists that didn't circulate widely. The 2,300-meter shot was in there. One line. A subordinate clause in a longer sentence about the outcome of an operation in a region whose name had been redacted. But it was in there. Harmon set the file down. Then she made 2 calls. The second one was to the office that handled personnel matters of this specific kind. The first one was to Breckinridge's chain of command. Breckinridge spent the morning of the following day unaware that any of this was in motion. This was the pattern that the people around him later recognized. In retrospect, he had a talent for being confidently wrong about situations. It wasn't stupidity exactly. It was more like a persistent failure of imagination, an inability to conceive of a version of events in which he was not the most significant figure in the room. He'd built his career on a version of competence that was real but limited, and he'd learned to perform the perimeter of it in a way that kept most people from probing too deeply at the center. He was in his office at 1100 when his sergeant major knocked. The conversation that followed was brief. Harmon's call had worked through the chain with a speed that Breckinridge would not have predicted, because he didn't know enough about Ryland to understand what set of relationships and institutional debts had just been activated on her behalf. His sergeant major, who did not look at him when he delivered the information, told him he was due to report to the IG office at 1400. Breckinridge said, "What is this about?" His sergeant major said, with the specific flatness of a man who has made a decision about where his loyalties lie, "The incident at the club, that was nothing," Breckinridge said. His sergeant major said nothing in return. The IG interview lasted 2.5 hours. Tully cooperated fully, which surprised no one who understood Tully's fundamental orientation towards self-preservation. Fairchild provided a written statement that was, by any honest reading, an accounting of a man who'd been present for something wrong and had calculated the cost of intervention and found it too high until the cost of silence became higher. His statement confirmed the sequence of events. It confirmed who had touched whom and in what order. It did not add anything that reflected well on him personally, but it also did not obstruct. Rylan was not the subject of the investigation. She was interviewed briefly, and her account was consistent with every other account, because she had done nothing other than defend herself, and she described it with the same flat precision she brought to operational reporting. She said what happened. She did not editorialize. She did not say anything about Breckinridge that wasn't documentable. She didn't need to. The documentation was doing its own work by that point. There is a thing that happens when a case like this develops inside a military structure that doesn't happen the same way in civilian contexts. The institution begins to surface information that was always present, but not in active circulation. Previous incidents, previous reports, the paper trail that accumulates around a person who has a pattern. Breckinridge had a pattern. It was not dramatic. It was, instead, the kind of low-grade consistent record of behavior that tends to live in files until something catalyzes it. The incident with Rylan was the catalyst. Odom found her in the gym on the 4th day, which was where she went when she needed to not think about things. She was on the cable machine, working her left shoulder through a range of motion that her physical therapist had specified, and she had earbuds in, and she did not look up when he sat down on the bench across from her. He waited until she pulled one earbud out. He said, "You know what's happening with Breckinridge?" She said, "I know what's happening. They're looking at 2 prior incidents. One was a complaint that was never formalized. I know, she said. Harmon personally requested your full file. She said nothing. Rylan, he said, and he used her name in the way people use names when they are trying to get someone to let them in, even briefly. Did you know what you were doing when you didn't push him away before it escalated? She thought about that. She was still working the cable, slow and controlled, watching her shoulder in the mirror the way the therapist had told her to. I knew he was going to do something, she said finally. I didn't know what. I knew if I stopped him before, he'd just do it to someone else. Odom sat with that for a moment. That's a complicated calculation, he said. Most of them are, she said. She put the earbud back in. The outcome when it came arrived in the format that military outcomes often do. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulation of paperwork and proceedings and quiet conversations behind closed doors that eventually produce a result that feels, to the outside observer, like it arrived suddenly. Breckenridge was relieved. The previous complaints were formalized. There would be a board. The details of what happened after that live in the kind of institutional record that the Army maintains but does not publicize. Fairchild received a formal counseling statement that would follow him through his next evaluation cycle. It was not career-ending. He would later tell people, in conversations that were more honest than he usually allowed himself, that it was the most useful thing that had ever happened to him. Whether he acted on that assessment was a matter for his own conscience. Tully received nothing official because the record didn't support it. He transferred to a different duty station 6 months later by his own request. File was reviewed by 2 separate offices at the request of Colonel Harmon for purposes that were not fully disclosed to Rylan herself at the time. She found out what those purposes were on a Thursday in November in a meeting she'd been given no advance information about in an office in a building on post that she'd walked past many times without ever going inside. The meeting was with 2 people she recognized and one she didn't. The one she didn't recognize introduced himself with a first name only, which in certain contexts is as much identification as you need. He was from an office that operates at the intersection of the special operations community and a layer of institutional authority that most people don't know exists. He was the kind of man who moved through large rooms without taking up obvious space. He said, "We've been aware of your record for some time." She said, "I assumed." He said, "There's a program. It's a small one. It doesn't recruit widely, for reasons I don't need to explain." She said, "What does it require?" He told her. There was a pause, not because she was uncertain, because she was being precise about what she was agreeing to, which was the same precision she brought to every other calculation in her life, and which was, if he understood her file the way he appeared to, something he recognized as a professional habit rather than hesitation. She said, "When do I start?" 3 months later, she was in a different country, in a context she will not discuss, and that the people who know what she does don't ask about. The shoulder was better. The physical therapist had cleared her for full operational duty 6 weeks after the evaluation, which was 2 weeks ahead of the timeline he'd originally estimated. Because she'd done every prescribed exercise with the same methodical consistency she brought to everything, and because she had, characteristically, said nothing about the level of discomfort involved. What she thought about, on the flight to wherever she was going, there were 2 legs. One connection through a hub that was not in the continental United States was something that didn't have clean edges. It wasn't pride. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was more like the quiet that happens after a long period of noise, when the noise has been so constant that you stopped hearing it and only know it was there because of how different the silence feels. She thought about the bar, about the beer she'd been trying to finish, about Odom's message on her phone, about the particular quality of stillness that had come over her in the moment after she'd been struck. That interval between stimulus and response that most people don't have access to, that she'd spent years training into herself until it felt less like discipline and more like something she'd been built with. She thought about what Odom had asked her. "Did you know what you were doing?" The honest answer was more layered than the one she'd given him. She'd known, in the way you know things when you've been operating long enough, that Breckenridge was the kind of problem that persists until it's made undeniable. She hadn't engineered what happened. She hadn't gone to the club looking for it. But she had, when the moment arrived, understood something about what it could become, what it could surface, what it could formalize, what it could set in motion for for people who had no access to the mechanisms she understood. The woman who'd filed the complaint that was never formalized. She didn't know her name. She didn't need to. The plane began its descent through a cloud layer that turned everything outside the window to white. She adjusted her seatbelt with the absent mechanical habit of someone who has logged more flight hours than they can usefully remember. She closed the folder she'd been reviewing. She put the folder in the bag. She looked out the window at the white and didn't think about the 2,300 meters, or the crosswind that shifted twice, or any of the places she'd been that didn't appear in the public record. She thought about what the man in the building had said to her, in that small office, before the meeting ended. He'd said, gathering his things, almost as an afterthought, "How long have you been waiting for someone to look at your file properly?" She'd thought about it, genuinely. "Since the first time I filled one out," she said. He'd nodded, not sympathetically. The way you nod when a number confirms an estimate. The cloud layer broke. Below it was somewhere she was needed. She was already thinking about what came next.